In the winter of 1986, a Pennsylvania housewife named Janet Smurl was standing in her kitchen, ironing her daughter's communion dress, when the temperature in the room dropped so fast she could see her own breath. She turned around. Standing 3 feet away from her, in the middle of a sunlit kitchen at 11 o'clock in the morning, was the outline of a person made entirely of moving black smoke. It had no face. It had no sound. And as Janet stood frozen, unable to scream, unable to move, it began walking toward her. What happened next would be witnessed not just by Janet, but by her husband, her 4 daughters, her elderly in-laws, her neighbors, 2 of the most famous paranormal investigators in American history, and eventually, millions of people watching the evening news. For 13 years, a family in a quiet mining town swore that something lived inside the walls of their home. Something that watched them undress. Something that climbed into their beds at night. Something that, according to the people who came to help them, was not a ghost at all. This is the story of the house on Chase Street, and the question that has never been fully answered. Was the Smurl family the victim of one of the most violent hauntings ever recorded in the United States? Or were they the victims of something else entirely? Stay until the end, because the answer depends entirely on who you believe. And after hearing everything that happened in that house, you may not be sure either. To understand what happened on Chase Street, you have to go back a few years earlier to a flood. In the early 1970s, Jack and Janet Smurl were a young couple living happily in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, sharing a home with Jack's parents, John and Mary. Jack worked steadily. Janet stayed home raising their 2 young daughters, Dawn and Kim, and by all accounts, life was good. Quiet. Normal. Then in 1972, Hurricane Agnes tore through the region. The Smurl home was submerged under more than 10 feet of floodwater in a matter of hours. No one was hurt, but the house was destroyed beyond repair, and the local redevelopment authority eventually took the property entirely. For a family that had just lost everything, the next decision was simple: stick together. John and Mary Smurl found a duplex for sale in the nearby town of West Pittston, a side-by-side house, 2 separate homes under one roof, sharing a single wall down the middle. The plan was straightforward. John and Mary would buy one half. Jack and Janet would buy the other half, at a reduced price, and the 2 families would live side by side just as they always had. It was a fixer-upper. It needed work, but it was theirs, and it was affordable. And in August of 1973, the Smurl family moved into 328 and 330 Chase Street. What they didn't know, what almost nobody ever bothers to find out before buying a house, was that the property already had a reputation. Longtime residents of West Pittston would later tell reporters that the house had a history of disturbances. Police had supposedly been called to the address multiple times over the years for unexplained noise complaints, even when the building sat empty. Some neighbors claimed previous tenants had dabbled in the occult. Others said that if you walked past the place at night, you could sometimes see faces in the upstairs windows, in a house that nobody was living in. Of course, every town has a house like this. The place kids dare each other to ring the doorbell on Halloween. The place where every creak and groan gets turned into a ghost story over the decades. Most of the time, it's nothing. Old pipes. Settling foundations. Bored teenagers with too much imagination. And West Pittston had its own very real, very physical reason for things to creak and groan. The town sat on top of a network of abandoned coal mines, tunnels that had been dug out beneath the streets decades earlier, and then simply left to flood and collapse on their own schedule. By the 1970s, most of that ground had stabilized, but not all of it. Homes in the area were known to settle unexpectedly. And in a few unsettling cases, when older homes did collapse into old mine shafts, workers digging through the wreckage found something nobody expected buried in the mud around the foundations. The bones of pigs, buried deep for reasons nobody could explain. So when Jack and Janet Smurl moved into their new home with their 2 little girls, and quickly became 2 of the most well-liked, active members of the West Pittston community, Jack coaching, Janet volunteering, both of them embedded in their Catholic parish, nobody brought up the old stories about the house. Why would they? The Smurls were the kind of family every neighborhood wants. Friendly, hardworking, faithful. They had no idea that within a year, the first sign of something wrong would arrive in the form of a rug. The Smurl side of the duplex needed a lot of work, and like most young families taking on an old house, they did it in stages, a little money here, a little time there, fixing up one room at a time. Sometime in the mid-1970s, Mary Smurl, Jack's mother, bought a new rug for the living room on her side of the house. It was clean, new, freshly unrolled. Within a day, a large, dark, greasy stain appeared in the center of it. Not a spill, not a mark that had always been there. It simply appeared, and it was still wet to the touch. Mary scrubbed it out. 2 days later, it was back. She scrubbed it again. It came back again. Eventually, the family just stopped trying. On its own, that's the kind of thing you'd laugh off. A weird stain. Maybe something under the floorboards. Maybe a pipe. But it didn't stay isolated. The renovation work on the house turned into a slow nightmare of its own. Pipes that John Smurl, an experienced, skilled welder, had personally repaired and resoldered would mysteriously develop new leaks days later, soaking through walls that had just been patched. Tools would vanish from where they'd been set down 5 minutes earlier, only to turn up later in completely different rooms nobody had been working in. Jobs that should have taken an afternoon stretched into entire weekends because nothing stayed where it was put. Then, in 1974, Jack was sitting alone one evening, relaxing in front of the television, when the TV set in front of him simply burst into flames. Not sparked, not smoked. Caught fire, suddenly, while he was looking directly at it. Over the following months, other appliances in the house would start smoking or catching fire outright, with no clear electrical fault ever found. You could chalk that up to bad wiring in an old house, until the same thing happened to Jack's car, sitting in the driveway, with the engine off. It's worth pausing here, because this is the part of almost every haunting story where the family makes a choice without realizing they're making it. Every single one of these events, on its own, had a normal explanation sitting right there waiting to be picked. Old pipes leak. Wiring fails in old houses. People misplace tools. Stains happen. But when you live with this stuff every single day, for months, for years, at some point the pile of normal explanations gets too tall to ignore. And that's exactly the position the Smurl family found themselves in, long before anyone said the word demon out loud. In 1975, the family's oldest daughter, Dawn, who was about 5 years old at the time, started showing up in her parents' bedroom in the middle of the night after night, too frightened to sleep in her own room. At first, Jack and Janet did what most parents would do. They assumed it was a phase. Nightmares. A new house, new sounds, an overactive imagination. But the pattern didn't stop, and eventually Jack sat his daughter down and asked her directly what she was so afraid of. Dawn told him there were people in her room, floating, watching her. Every night, the same thing. Dawn would bolt into her parents' room, sobbing, terrified, and Jack would walk back with her to check and find absolutely nothing. An empty room. A quiet house. He'd tuck her back in, she'd settle, and a few nights later, it would happen again. On its own, a scared 5-year-old having nightmares about people in her room is about as common as childhood gets. Almost every parent has been through some version of this. But the Smurls were noticing something else happening at the same time throughout the rest of the house. Things a 5-year-old couldn't fake and didn't even know about. Radios would switch on by themselves at full volume in empty rooms. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, would echo through the upstairs hallway when everyone in the house was downstairs or in bed, or could be accounted for somewhere else entirely. The toilet would flush on its own in the dead of night, and running underneath almost all of it, like a heartbeat the family couldn't turn off. Banging, coming from inside the walls. Not pipes settling, not the house creaking, a rhythmic, deliberate banging, like knuckles on drywall from the inside. By 1977, Janet had given birth to twin daughters, Shannon and Karen, bringing the family to 6 people total on their side of the duplex. Life went on. The kids grew. The renovations continued in fits and starts, and the strange occurrences became, in a way, just another fact of life in the house. Background noise the family learned to live around. There's a particular kind of denial that happens in cases like this, and it's worth naming because it's so human. One morning, Jack and Janet were woken before dawn by an odd creaking sound coming from downstairs. They followed it to the front door, opened it, and found their lawn chairs on the porch, rocking back and forth, gently, rhythmically, in completely still morning air, as if someone had just gotten up out of them. They looked at each other, and they joked about it. They started telling people, half seriously, that they were sharing their house with a ghost, and for a while, that's genuinely how they treated it. Mostly harmless. A quirky old house with a quirky old ghost. The kind of thing you'd mention to dinner guests for a laugh. Then, one night, that framing fell apart completely. Late one night, Jack Smurl woke up to the feeling of his shoulders being rubbed. Slow, deliberate, sensual pressure, the kind of touch you'd recognize instantly from your spouse. Still half asleep, Jack felt a wave of warmth and comfort wash over him. His wife, awake beside him, touching him. He turned his head to look at her. Janet was fast asleep, facing the other direction, completely still. Jack didn't sleep again that night. It's hard to overstate how this single moment changes everything that came before it. A scared kid having nightmares, explainable. A radio turning on, explainable. A weird stain on a rug, explainable. But something physically touching you in your own bed, in a way clearly meant to be intimate, while the only other person in the room is unconscious 3 feet away, that's not background noise anymore. That's not a quirky old ghost story for dinner guests. By 1983, a new phenomenon joined the list, and it would become one of the most consistent and most disturbing parts of the entire case: a foul odor. Not occasionally, repeatedly, unpredictably, for years. A smell the family struggled to even describe, beyond simply calling it rotten. It would fill a room without warning, linger for a while, and then vanish completely, leaving no trace and no source. Around this same time, something else started happening, something that had nothing to do with ghosts, at least not directly. John and Mary Smurl, living on the other side of that shared wall, began hearing their son and his wife through it. Arguments. Shouting. Jack's voice, raised, angry at Janet, loud enough and frequent enough that his own parents became genuinely worried for Janet's safety. One day, John had heard enough. He stormed out of his side of the duplex, walked over to Jack and Janet's front door, and let himself in, ready to confront his son. He found Jack, Janet, and all 4 girls sitting together in the living room. Calm, quiet, watching television. A peaceful family evening. They had no idea what John was talking about. Nobody had been arguing. Nobody had raised their voice. And yet John had heard it, clearly, unmistakably, through a wall that, apparently, had been carrying sounds that never actually happened on the other side of it. It was around this same period, the early winter of 1986, that Janet found herself alone in the basement, doing laundry, when she heard a woman's voice call her name. It was a cold winter morning, the kind where the light coming through a small basement window is thin and gray and doesn't really illuminate anything. Janet Smurl was downstairs alone, loading the washing machine. Her 4 daughters were at school. Jack was at work. Upstairs, the only sound in the house was the muffled hum of a game show playing to an empty living room. Janet started the machine, picked up the empty laundry basket, and turned to head back upstairs. That's when she heard someone call her name. She stopped, looked around. The basement was small, cluttered with boxes of Christmas decorations, and completely empty except for her. She told herself she'd imagined it, maybe the TV upstairs, maybe her own thoughts playing tricks. She turned to leave again. It called her name a second time. This time there was no mistaking it. A woman's voice, soft, whispery, and it had come from directly behind her. Janet spun around. Nothing there. just boxes, just the gray window, just the rhythmic thud of the washing machine. The voice called her name a third time, and this time, Janet swore she heard something underneath it. A giggle. A small, private laugh, like someone enjoying a joke at her expense. She started backing toward the stairs. The voice called out again, mocking now, almost playful in its cruelty, the tone of something that knew exactly how frightened she was and found it entertaining. Janet reached the bottom of the stairs and, in a moment of pure defiance, she shouted back, "What do you want?" Silence. Just the washer. Just the TV upstairs. She stood there a moment, scanning the room one more time. Completely empty. Maybe she'd just imagined the whole thing. Maybe she really had been spending too much time alone in this house. She had almost convinced herself of that. And then, just as she turned to go, the voice called out to her one final time. Same mocking tone, same private amusement, and Janet didn't look back again. She bolted up the stairs and slammed the basement door behind her. That morning marked a turning point. It was the first time Janet herself had experienced something she could not explain away, with no one else around to blame, no radio to misattribute it to, nothing. And it had happened only weeks before something far stranger would happen in broad daylight, in her own kitchen. It was February. Janet was alone in the house again, standing at the ironing board in her kitchen, pressing her daughter Kim's white dress for an upcoming church event. Without warning, the room turned cold. Not someone left a window open cold, instantly, sharply cold, the kind of cold that makes you see your own breath indoors. Janet looked up automatically, expecting to find a window had blown open in the February wind. Instead, she found herself looking at a shape. It stood a few feet away from her, in the middle of her sunlit kitchen. It was roughly the size and outline of a person, but its body wasn't solid. It was made of something like black smoke, constantly shifting and moving, holding its human shape the way smoke can briefly hold the shape of whatever it's pouring out of. It had no face, no features at all, just a dark, featureless space where a face should be. And Janet had the unmistakable sense that it was looking at her anyway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the shape began walking toward her, and as it moved, Janet noticed something trailing behind it, fluttering with each step, like the edge of a long black cape, made of that same shifting, smoky material. It took only a few steps to cross the kitchen. Janet braced herself, certain it was about to collide with her, and it simply passed through her, like she wasn't there, and continued out through the kitchen doorway into the living room. Janet didn't wait to see where it went. She ran, out of her own house, across the shared porch, into her in-law's side of the duplex, and found Mary Smurl sitting in her living room chair, looking shaken. Mary barely acknowledged Janet walking in. Given that Mary had recently suffered a heart attack and had been unwell, Janet didn't immediately think much of it, until Mary spoke first. Mary told Janet she thought she might be losing her mind. Just moments earlier, at almost exactly the same time Janet had been in her kitchen, Mary had watched a black, smoke-like, human-shaped figure walk directly through a solid wall, cross her hallway, and disappear. Two women, two sides of the same duplex, the same impossible shape, at the same moment, walking through walls that should have made that physically impossible. For a while after that, the activity seemed to settle. Weeks passed with nothing unusual at all, and as time always does, it started to soften the edges of what had happened. Maybe the family told themselves that really had been the peak of it. Maybe it was over. It wasn't over. It was the calm before something far worse. The Smurls were, by every account, a devoutly Catholic family. Church on Sundays, the kids in religious education, the whole structure of their lives built around their faith. So when their daughter Kim's first Holy Communion approached, it was a significant occasion in the household, and Janet wanted everything to be perfect. One evening, Janet was in the kitchen with her daughters, ironing Kim's communion dress, white, formal, carefully pressed, when they all heard a sharp, sudden creaking sound directly above them. Janet and Kim instinctively ducked. A 4-foot-long light fixture, mounted to the ceiling directly above where they'd been standing, came crashing down without any warning at all. Janet and Kim managed to avoid it. Young Shannon, standing a little further back, wasn't quite fast enough. She took a glancing hit from the falling fixture. She was shaken, but not seriously hurt. When Jack examined the damage afterward, what he found didn't look like a fixture that had simply worked itself loose over time. The mounting in the ceiling looked torn, damaged in a way that suggested the fixture had been ripped out of place by force, not gradually shaken free by gravity and bad screws. Just days after that, Janet had taken all 4 girls out shopping for new school clothes, leaving Jack home alone for the evening. He'd settled onto the bed with a book after a long day at work and drifted off without meaning to. He woke up a few hours later with the distinct, disorienting feeling that something was wrong, though at first he couldn't place what. It took him a moment to realize what his body was telling him. He was floating, roughly 2 feet above his own mattress, in the dark, in complete silence. The moment he registered what was happening and began to struggle, he dropped straight back down onto the bed hard. And then, nothing. Silence. Stillness. As if it had never happened at all. Jack lay there in the dark for a long time afterward, not moving, not sure what to do with what he'd just experienced. There was no one to tell, in that moment, who would believe him, not even his own wife, asleep with the girls a few rooms over, unaware that anything had happened at all. That night was, in hindsight, the last quiet night the Smurl family would have for a very long time. Because in the summer of 1985, everything changed, and it changed all at once. What had been, for over a decade, a slow accumulation of strange and unsettling moments, a stain here, a voice there, a cold spot, a shape in the kitchen, suddenly, in the summer of 1985, became something violent. One night, Jack and Janet had gone to bed as normal, and in the middle of the night, Janet felt herself being pulled, hard, and with clear direction, out of the bed by something she could not see. This wasn't a feeling of being startled awake, or imagining a tug in a half-dream. Janet was being physically dragged across the bed by an invisible force strong enough that Jack, fully awake now and grabbing for his wife's hand, had to actively fight against it to keep her from being pulled off the bed entirely. For a moment, it became a literal tug-of-war, Jack pulling one way, something unseen pulling the other, with Janet caught in the middle. And then, as suddenly as it started, whatever was pulling simply let go and retreated. Almost instantly, the banging in the walls returned, louder than it had ever been before. And the smell returned with it, stronger than ever. Whatever had just failed to take Janet out of that bed was, by every indication the family could read, furious about it. From that night forward, the Smurls were no longer dealing with an occasional disturbance. They were living in a state of near constant fear, in their own home, every single day. And they had already poured years of money and work into that home. Moving wasn't a simple option. Financially, it wasn't an option at all. They had nowhere else to go, and whatever was in that house with them seemed to understand that perfectly. Just days after the bed-pulling incident, the family's German shepherd, Simon, a large, protective dog who had been a calm and steady presence in the house for years, was lying on the kitchen floor next to Janet when he was suddenly, violently lifted off the ground and thrown bodily into the kitchen door. The children began reporting a new sound at night, a fluttering, rushing sound in their bedrooms, like the beating of enormous wings from something they couldn't see, as if a massive bird, far too large to be real, was circling the room above their beds in the dark. One night, Jack and Janet were jolted awake by a crash from the stairs, followed by their daughter Shannon sobbing. They found her at the bottom of the staircase. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there, no memory of falling, nothing. One moment she'd been in bed. The next, she was crumpled at the bottom of the stairs, crying, with no explanation for either of them to offer. And then there was the smoke. On several separate nights, Janet woke to find smoke filling the bedroom, and when she reached over to wake Jack, she couldn't. He was in an unnaturally deep sleep, almost like a coma, completely unreachable no matter what she did. This became a recurring and deeply unsettling pattern throughout the haunting. Whenever something wanted to show itself to one of them, The other would be locked into a state of total unconsciousness, as if something was deliberately keeping them from witnessing it together. On one of these nights, the smoke in the room began to take on a humanoid shape, not unlike the black figure Janet and Mary had both seen in the kitchen months earlier. This time, the shape moved with purpose. It crossed the room and disappeared directly into the bedroom wardrobe. It wasn't just Jack and Janet's side of the duplex anymore either. Mary Smurl reported one night, while John was out, that her entire mattress, with her on it, was lifted off the bed frame and then dropped back down, hard enough to injure her leg. By this point, Janet had started doing what a lot of people in her position do. She started researching. Books on the paranormal, on hauntings, on anything that might explain what was happening to her family, and, more importantly, what might stop it. Twice, the family arranged for priests who were personal friends to come and bless the house. And both times, the same pattern emerged. The activity would quiet down for a short while afterward, only to come roaring back, often more intensely than before, as if whatever was in the house was simply absorbing the attempt and pushing back harder. Eventually, through a friend, Janet was introduced to a university professor with an academic interest in paranormal phenomena. He listened to her story, told her honestly that he wasn't able to help her himself, but that he knew two people who might be. He gave her a phone number. The names on the other end of that line were Ed and Lorraine Warren. By 1986, the names Ed and Lorraine Warren were already well known across the country. Ed described himself as a demonologist, by his own account, one of only a handful of people in the entire United States who held that title. Lorraine was a self-described clairvoyant. Together, the couple claimed to have personally investigated thousands of paranormal cases over several decades, and their involvement in a previous, infamous Long Island haunting had already made them recognizable names in American pop culture, years before any of the films based on their work existed. To call the Warrens a controversial duo would be an understatement. To their supporters, they were dedicated, faith-driven investigators who had spent their lives helping families nobody else would. To their critics, they were opportunists, investigators who showed up to frighten families, told them their problem was demonic, and then built books, lecture tours, and media careers around the resulting story. We'll come back to that tension later because it matters for how this case played out. But for now, all that mattered to Janet Smurl was that, for the first time in over a decade, someone with a reputation for taking this seriously was willing to come to her house. The Warrens arrived and sat down at the Smurls' kitchen table for what Jack and Janet later described as feeling less like a friendly visit and more like an interrogation. Ed asked direct, pointed questions. Had anyone in the family ever experimented with anything occult? Ever used a Ouija board? Did anyone practice anything that could be considered Satanism? While Ed conducted that interview, Lorraine and another member of their team, a woman named Diane, who also worked as a psychic, walked through the house. Both women later said they felt a wave of dread the moment they stepped inside, a feeling that intensified as they moved upstairs. They were drawn, almost magnetically, to the master bedroom, and specifically to the wardrobe. The same wardrobe the smoke shape had disappeared into months earlier, though nobody had told them that. Standing in front of it, they were hit with the same foul odor the family had been describing for years. Both women said they could see nothing physically inside or around the wardrobe, but both felt an overwhelming sense that something was using it as a kind of doorway or hiding place. Lorraine came back downstairs and gave the family her reading of the situation. According to her, there wasn't just one entity in the house. There were four. The first, she said, was the spirit of an elderly woman, confused, possibly suffering from dementia in life, who had likely passed away somewhere in or near the property. Frightening to look at, perhaps, but ultimately harmless. The second was the spirit of a younger woman, and this one, Lorraine said, was not harmless at all. She described this presence as violent, unstable, and dangerous. The third was the spirit of a man. Lorraine sensed he had a mustache, and that he was capable of violence, though she couldn't say much more about him at that point. And the fourth wasn't a spirit at all. According to Lorraine and Ed, the fourth presence was a demon, and it had been there, dormant, for decades. likely far longer than the Smurl family had even owned the house. Something, they said, had recently woken it up, and once awake, it had begun feeding off the family, off their fear, their confusion, their exhaustion, the way a battery draws power. Ed laid out what he described as the 4 stages of demonic activity: infestation, oppression, possession, and finally, death. According to the Warrens, the Smurl family was already well past the first stage. That very first night, with the Warrens still in the house, some of the phenomena the family had described for years played out in front of them. The mirrors in the bedroom began to move on their own, and a small portable television, one the family had unplugged years earlier out of fear it might catch fire, the same way other appliances had, suddenly switched on by itself. In the static on the screen, both Ed and Lorraine said they could make out shapes, figures. Watching back, the Warrens' advice was straightforward and rooted entirely in their Catholic framework: prayer and holy water, kept on hand and used the moment anything happened. They began visiting the house regularly, sometimes daily, and their real focus quickly became getting the local Catholic diocese involved, because in their experience, what a case like this ultimately needed wasn't a family praying in their kitchen. It needed the church, formally, with the authority to perform an exorcism. That night, after the Warrens left, the family settled in for what they hoped might be a quieter evening. It wasn't. In Jack and Janet's bedroom that night, as they tried to sleep, Janet was struck, repeatedly, by what felt like an open hand, slapping her, though there was no one there to do it. The banging in the walls grew louder than it had ever been. And once again, the small television lit up on its own, with those same shapes moving in the static. By around 3 in the morning, the activity finally died down. Throughout the night, Jack and the family dog, Simon, had patrolled the house together, Simon refusing to leave his post in the hallway outside the girls' bedroom door, standing guard against something neither of them could see. Following the Warrens' instructions, the family purchased religious items from a local church shop and brought them to a priest to be blessed. The priest agreed, though reluctantly, and it was becoming increasingly clear that, while individual clergy were willing to offer some support, the church as an institution was not yet treating this case as urgent. Part of that hesitation almost certainly came from the Warrens' own reputation. After their very public involvement in the earlier Long Island case, many in the church were wary of being pulled into another media spectacle. A few nights later, Jack woke around 2 in the morning to the sound of 2 women's voices in his bedroom. Half asleep, his first assumption was that it must be his twin daughters, awake and talking. He opened his eyes. Standing at the foot of his bed were 2 women he had never seen before, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, lit faintly by the glow of the television. Before he could react, they vanished. The following night, it happened again, but this time, the 2 women appeared in the darkened corner of the bedroom, and they stayed. Jack tried to wake Janet beside him. He couldn't. She was locked in that same unnaturally deep sleep. This time, the women seemed aware that Jack could see them. He could make out their ages now. One appeared to be around 40, the other in her early 20s. They were whispering to each other, and as Jack watched, paralyzed and unable to make a sound, the younger woman slowly turned to look directly at him, her expression curling into an unnervingly wide smile. The 2 of them continued staring at Jack, whispering, smiling, and then they stepped backward into the darkness near the wardrobe and were gone. Around this same time, the Warrens managed to arrange for a second priest to come and bless the house. Shortly afterward, Ed attempted something he called religious provocation, a deliberate ritual intended to provoke whatever was in the house into revealing itself more directly, so it could be identified and confronted. According to those present, it worked, in a sense. Partway through, Ed himself began choking, to the point of near unconsciousness, before whatever was happening released him. After that night, members of the family began finding bite marks and scratches on their skin, appearing with no warning, no cause, and no explanation. They'd simply wake up with them. On the other side of the duplex, Mary Smurl had her own encounter with the black shadow figure in her doorway, except this time, she described something new, a feeling that it wasn't just present. It was trying to communicate with her, trying, she felt, to convince her to follow it into the dark. By now, something was happening in that house every single day, and it was about to take a turn that none of them, not the family, not the Warrens, not the priests, were prepared for. On the night of June 21st, Jack was jolted awake in bed, the same way he had been before, sudden, violent, with no clear cause. He scanned the room and saw nothing out of place. Then he became aware that he wasn't alone. What climbed onto the bed beside him that night was unlike anything the family had described before, and it would mark the beginning of the most disturbing chapter of the entire case. According to Jack, the presence appeared as a figure with the face of an elderly woman, but the body of someone much younger. Her skin was described as pale and unhealthy, marked with open sores. Her eyes were a vivid red. Jack realized, in the moments that followed, that he was completely paralyzed, fully conscious, fully aware, but unable to move a single muscle below his neck. And in that state, he experienced what he could only describe afterward as a sexual assault by this presence, while it stared at him the entire time. When it was finished, it retreated back into the darkness of the room and vanished. The moment Jack regained the ability to move, he found himself covered in a foul-smelling residue. He went straight to the shower and scrubbed himself raw, and the next day, his body ached in a way that no nightmare could explain. He told Janet everything. She broke down in tears, not just from fear for herself anymore, but from the realization of how far this had escalated and what it might mean for the rest of the family. The next morning at breakfast, their daughter Dawn, without knowing anything about what had happened the night before, described a nightmare she'd had. In her dream, she had seen, in detail, exactly what had happened to her father. In the days that followed, Janet experienced something similar, an assault by an unseen presence, though by her account it didn't escalate as far as what Jack had described. One of the Warrens' team members, on a phone call relaying these new developments, played back a recording he'd made inside the house. Underneath the now familiar banging in the walls, there was something else on the tape, the unmistakable sound of pigs squealing. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something directly. This part of the case is, by far, the most disturbing, and it's also the part skeptics point to most often when they question what was really happening in that house, whether through genuine paranormal activity, through the psychological toll of years of fear and sleep disruption, or through some combination of both. We're not going to dwell on the graphic details beyond what's necessary to understand the timeline. But we can't leave this part out either, because, for better or worse, it's the part of the Smurl case that changed everything that came next. It's the point at which the Warrens decided this had gone far beyond anything the local clergy had been willing to engage with, and the point at which they brought in someone they hoped could actually help, a priest with experience performing exorcisms. With the local Catholic diocese still unwilling to formally intervene, the Warrens reached out to a priest they had known and trusted for years, Father Robert McKenna, based in Connecticut, an experienced practitioner of the older Catholic exorcism rites. He agreed to come to Chase Street and perform what would become the first of several exorcisms on the house. The night before he was due to arrive, Jack had another encounter with the two women who'd appeared before, except this time they weren't alone. A third figure joined them, a middle-aged man. Jack, once again paralyzed in his bed, found this man leaning in close to his face, repeating the same phrase to him over and over, "You will pay for this." The two women stood behind him, whispering, watching, even laughing at Jack's terror, before all three figures simply faded away. Father McKenna's exorcism took place as planned. By most accounts, it didn't resolve the situation, but it did seem to change his character. The activity that followed was less violent, less escalatory, and started to resemble more traditional poltergeist behavior. Noise, movement, disturbance, without the same level of direct physical assault. But the toll on everyone involved was severe. Several people connected to the case, including, by some accounts, Ed Warren himself, fell ill around this time, to the point that Ed wasn't able to attend the exorcism in person. And in the days that followed, the Smurl's youngest daughter, Karen, came down with a severe, frightening illness of her own, losing a significant amount of weight over a short period before her fever finally broke. The family's bathroom had, for some time, been a focal point for strange activity, and that pattern continued in increasingly disturbing ways, affecting more than just Jack and Janet. Their teenage daughter Dawn, 16 at the time, was getting ready to shower one evening when she heard the familiar banging start up inside the walls. By this point, the sound was so common in the household that it barely registered anymore. The family had become numb to it, in a way that's almost sadder than if they'd still been frightened by it every time. This time was different. While in the shower, Dawn felt something grab her arms, firmly, with real physical pressure, and pin her against the shower wall. She fought her way free, threw herself out of the shower, and collapsed on the bathroom floor, screaming for her parents. Around the same time, both Jack and Janet continued to find bite marks and scratches appearing on their bodies overnight, with no explanation. Apparitions kept appearing as well. Jack, watching television alone one night, looked up to find a young man with long hair standing across the room, staring at him with what Jack described as a deeply unsettling smile. Janet, taking a bath, one of the only places in the house she might hope for a moment of privacy, looked up to see a small, roughly 3-foot-tall humanoid figure beginning to materialize in front of her, covered in the same unpleasant residue that had been associated with earlier encounters. She didn't wait around to see what it would do. She left the bathroom immediately. Mary Smurl, meanwhile, continued to be visited by the black shadow figure on her side of the house. A visiting relative reported seeing an elderly woman they didn't recognize, staring out from one of the duplex's windows. And Jack experienced another levitation, waking up in the air above his bed, before being thrown forcefully into a wall. By this point, the family was utterly exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. And like a lot of families under that kind of sustained pressure, they did the only thing they could think of to get away from it. Even briefly, they packed up the camper van and left town. The family drove to a campground in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, far enough away from Chase Street that, for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to hope for a few days of genuine peace. On the first evening, around 9:15 p.m., Jack was starting a campfire. Simon the dog was lying nearby, enjoying the warmth, until, suddenly, he jumped up, stiffened, and began growling, staring intently toward a line of bushes a short distance away. Jack followed the dog's line of sight. Standing at the edge of the bushes, watching them, was a young girl, no older than 14, by Jack's estimate. She was dressed in old-fashioned, colonial-style clothing. She was looking directly at Jack, and she was smiling, a fixed, unnatural smile that didn't change, didn't waver, didn't blink. She didn't move. She just stood there, smiling at him, until she slowly faded out of sight. Jack walked toward the bushes to look closer, and the girl reappeared for just a moment before vanishing again. Later that night, gathered around the campfire, the family heard something else, the distant sound of a young girl somewhere out in the dark, calling for help. They searched the area. There was no one there. It was at this point that the full weight of their situation really sank in. This wasn't something tied to the house. Whatever this was, it had followed them. Back at Chase Street, while the family was away, their neighbors had their own strange experiences. Several reported hearing screaming coming from inside the empty Smurl residence in the middle of the night, despite knowing for certain that nobody was home. On other occasions, neighbors described hearing what sounded like enormous flocks of large birds circling the house, the same fluttering, wing-like sound the Smurl children had described hearing in their bedrooms for months. One neighbor, concerned, called the Smurl house to check whether anyone had stayed behind. The phone was answered by the voice of a young girl, a voice the neighbor didn't recognize. When she asked who she was talking to, the girl on the line simply laughed, over and over, until the call disconnected. Nobody answered again. When the family returned from the camping trip, the activity resumed almost immediately, the black figure appearing on both sides of the duplex again. Family members waking up mid-levitation, all of it picking back up as though it had never paused at all. Even Jack's workplace wasn't off limits anymore. His coworkers, who, by this point, were well aware of what was going on at his home, began reporting strange things happening around the office whenever Jack was there. The same foul smell the family knew so well would appear out of nowhere. Office phones would suddenly start buzzing loudly, with no cause. One coworker described hearing a banging sound coming from inside a radio, distinct enough that he was genuinely convinced something was trying to get out of it. At home, Janet continued to be targeted by physical assaults, often at the moments she was most vulnerable, lying down with a headache, alone in the bathroom, trying to rest. During one of these incidents, she described feeling unseen hands moving up her body before tightening around her throat, to the point that her vision began to go dark. Simon the dog lunged at whatever was attacking her and passed straight through it, as though it wasn't physically there at all. Janet later said that using a visualization technique Ed Warren had taught her seemed to cause the attack to retreat. The following day, Father McKenna returned to perform a second exorcism. By his own private assessment afterward, he knew it hadn't fully resolved anything. During one quieter moment, Janet had an experience that stood apart from everything else. An apparition of an elderly woman appeared at the foot of her bed, but for the first time, it didn't feel threatening. Janet described it as feeling almost peaceful, as though this presence was trying to communicate something to her, though no sound ever came. By now, the family had reached a breaking point. They decided to go public. They agreed to an anonymous television interview, hoping that, even without revealing their identity to viewers, the diocese would recognize the story as their own and finally feel pressured into formal action. If the goal was to provoke a reaction, it worked, just not the one they wanted. On the drive to the studio, Jack and Janet's car was nearly forced off the road by what felt like an unseen force pushing against it. By the time they arrived for the interview, neither of them had slept. Their bed at the motel the night before had reportedly shaken violently throughout the night. The interview itself went smoothly. The drive home did not. Janet was attacked again that night, with enough force that she genuinely believed whatever was doing it was trying to break her bones. And Jack experienced something new, something that, even after everything the family had already been through, terrified him more than anything before it. He woke to the sound of breathing. When he opened his eyes, standing over him was a creature he described as roughly 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs, with a furry body, glowing red eyes, and the snout of a pig. It reached toward him with long, claw-like fingers as Jack screamed, loud enough, finally, to wake Janet from her usual unnatural sleep. But by the time she opened her eyes, it was gone. Janet later said that whatever Jack had seen that night had visibly changed him, broken something in him that didn't come back. Just days later, Janet had her own encounter with a new figure, a man with a mustache and horns protruding from his head. The same creature Jack had seen returned not long after. He'd gotten up in the night to use the bathroom, flipped on the light, and there it was again, the same half-man, half-animal shape, this time charging at him, squealing as it moved. Jack ran. It chased him back into the bedroom and cornered him against the wall. He closed his eyes, certain this was it. When he opened them again, it was gone. Not long after, Janet had an experience that, compared to everything else, sounds almost mundane, but shook the family in a different way. Lying in bed one morning, she felt something grip the back of her neck from behind, despite lying flat on her back. As she struggled, she looked down and saw, unmistakably, a human hand pressing up through the surface of her mattress from underneath. And then there was Shannon. One afternoon, Janet heard her daughter Shannon screaming upstairs and ran to find her. Shannon was crying, telling her mother there'd been a man in her room, going through her toy box. Not a one-time thing either. Shannon said he'd been there before, that he smelled bad. Janet asked, carefully, gently, whether the man had ever hurt her. Shannon said no. He'd never touched her. He just stared. And it scared her. It scared her a lot. Of everything the family had been through, the assaults, the creatures, the levitations, it was this moment, a young child describing being silently watched in her own bedroom, that finally pushed the family to take the most drastic step yet, going to the press, on the record, by name. When the Smurl family finally decided to tell their story publicly, on the record, under their own names, What happened next was something none of them had fully anticipated. The country, still riding the cultural wave of stories like the Amityville Horror, was desperate for its next big haunting story. And in the Smurls, it had found one. Within days of the initial press reports, media outlets from across the country descended on West Pittston. Television crews set up on the street. Newspaper reporters knocked on doors. The Smurl home went from being a source of private terror to being a tourist attraction, a mystery, a spectacle. Hundreds of people showed up. The police had to close off the street to manage the crowds. What was supposed to be a plea for help, a family desperately hoping the attention would force the church to take formal action, turned into something far more complex and far more difficult. The family couldn't leave their home without being hounded by reporters and onlookers. But if they stayed inside, they were still being terrorized by whatever was in that house with them. They were trapped between two nightmares. The public attention also attracted other types of visitors. At one point, a self-identified coven of witches showed up at the property and asked for permission to perform rituals to help cleanse the house. Sinister-looking figures were spotted lingering outside the property at night. The quiet, respectable mining town of West Pittston, which had never wanted to be known for anything like this, turned hostile. The neighbors, understandably furious about the chaos, started calling the police themselves. But there was one bright spot in the madness. A psychic named Betty Ann Moore contacted the family and came to visit the house. Unlike the Warrens' broader diagnosis of demonic possession, Betty Ann seemed to have specific knowledge about who was actually in the house and why. She identified 3 spirits, plus the darker entity, just as Lorraine had months earlier. But Betty Ann went further. One spirit, she said, was an elderly, senile woman named Abigail, harmless, confused, possibly a former resident who'd simply never left. The second was a man named Patrick, a large, mustachioed man who had died in the house. In life, he'd been violent, prone to beating his younger wife. One day, he came home and found her with another man. Patrick killed them both, strangling her and beating the other man to death. He'd been so consumed with rage and fear of punishment that he'd never truly crossed over, never accepted what he'd done. The third spirit was a violent, unstable woman, but not the wife Patrick had killed. A different woman entirely, one who had somehow become allied with the darker entity, who seemed to share its goal of tormenting or possessing a member of the family. And here's the detail that, if true, explains an awful lot about why Jack had been specifically targeted in some of these incidents. Janet, Betty Ann said, resembled Patrick's wife, and in his confusion, his anger, his unresolved rage, Patrick had somehow confused Jack's role in the household, seeing Jack as an interloper, a man who'd stolen what Patrick believed was his own wife. The demon itself, Betty Ann described as being everywhere, infested into the very walls of the house, feeding on the family's fear and confusion, and somehow orchestrating or amplifying the attacks from the spirits around it. The neighbors, meanwhile, reported that the phenomena had begun spreading to nearby houses. 6 different homes on Chase Street began reporting their own banging sounds, foul smells, and screaming in the night. It was as though, with the attention and the recognition, the presence was growing more powerful. As the press attention continued, something else began to happen. Public opinion started to shift. Rumors began circulating that the Smurls were profiting from the story, that book deals and movie rights were being discussed, and that the whole thing had been fabricated or at the very least massively exaggerated for profit. Some pointed a finger at the Warrens themselves, arguing that the Warrens had a vested interest in making every case bigger and scarier, because bigger and scarier meant bigger lecture tours, bigger book deals, more fame. One parapsychologist named Stephen Kaplan, who had peripheral involvement in the earlier Amityville case, actually suggested something particularly interesting, that while the Smurls may have genuinely experienced a haunting, the specific diagnosis of demonic possession had been entirely inserted into their minds by the Warrens, who had apparently done the same thing with Amityville. An organization of scientific skeptics and investigators called CCOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, wanted to come to the house and conduct their own investigation. The Smurls initially agreed, but when CSICOP's team arrived at the property, They found Jack standing on the porch with Ed Warren flanking him, and they were told they would not be allowed inside. The Smurls later claimed that Seacop had been among the first people they'd called for help, and that Seacop had dismissed them without taking them seriously. Seacop denied having any record of such an encounter. Jack then insisted that no paranormal investigators other than the Warrens would be allowed to investigate. He claimed he feared that provoking the entities further might put his family in even greater danger. There were other angles to the skeptical position as well. It was discovered that Jack had undergone brain surgery in 1983, a procedure to remove fluid buildup, and some psychologists speculated that this could have caused or contributed to hallucinations or psychological breaks. It was suggested that Jack's fear and his belief in what was happening could have created a kind of shared psychosis, a group hysteria that affected the rest of the family, who then started interpreting every unexplained sound or sensation through that same lens. The noises in the house could be explained, skeptics pointed out, by the settling of the abandoned mines beneath the property. The foul smell could be attributed to a faulty sewer main that had plagued the neighborhood for years. The stains, the fires, the missing tools, all of these had mundane explanations if you worked backward from a position of skepticism. The Warrens had claimed, repeatedly, that they'd gathered extensive video and audio evidence during their investigation. When pressed to release it, Ed first claimed he'd given it to a television station whose name he couldn't quite remember. When pressed again, he claimed it had all been turned over to the church as evidence. It was never publicly released. Nobody ever saw it. What's most likely, and what we might reasonably conclude from a distance, is that something happened in that house. Probably something genuinely unsettling and frightening to the family. But whether what happened was a decades-old demonic entity, a combination of psychological factors, the side effects of Jack's medical condition, the stress of living in a deteriorating house, exposure to carbon monoxide or other toxins, some combination of all of these, or something else entirely, we may never know. The evidence was never properly documented in a way that could be independently verified. What we do know is this: the family genuinely believed they were in danger. The Warrens genuinely believed they were dealing with demonic possession. And millions of people around the world watched this unfold and wondered if such a thing could actually happen. After the media attention became too much, after the streets had to be blocked and the crowds managed and police called repeatedly, the Scranton Diocese finally stepped in, not to help the family, but to take over the investigation from the Warrens and contain the situation. They brought Father McKenna back for a third exorcism, and for days afterward, the house was filled, not with terror, but with prayer. Friends, family members, and church representatives came together, covering the home in candlelight, focusing their collective faith on ridding the house of whatever was inside it. For Jack and Janet, who had felt utterly alone for so many years, this moment was powerful. Their home, which had been a place of misery and fear for over a decade, was suddenly filled with warmth, with light, with support, with people who believed them and were there to help. And for the first time in a very long time, it seemed to work. Weeks passed with no incidents. The family began to sleep again. They began to relax. For the first time since the late 1970s, they were able to spend a night in their own home without fear. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, just as the family was beginning to believe they might actually have their lives back, Jack was alone in the living room one evening. He turned off the television and was heading toward bed when he saw it. The black, faceless figure, standing there in his house, just as he'd seen it so many times before. The cape-like extension behind it, fluttering as it always had. But there was something different this time. Jack felt an overwhelming sense that the figure wasn't angry anymore. It was almost calling to him, trying to draw him closer, to tempt him into something. Jack resisted. And then it started again. The banging on the walls returned. The presence was back, though it seemed, at least for now, to have lost some of its previous intensity. The family would spend many more weeks in fear, though the activity never again reached the levels of violence and direct assault it had once achieved. Eventually, and this part of the story is worth noting, after the family had moved out and the spotlight had been taken off the house, the diocese did perform their own exorcism of the property. And according to some reports, subsequent residents have experienced no paranormal activity whatsoever. The Smurl family eventually found themselves in a financial position to leave. A book called The Haunted was published, and a television movie was made based on their experiences, which, in a way, vindicated the family's desperation to go public in the first place. The publicity that had felt so invasive while it was happening had, in the end, given them the resources to escape. Karen Smurl, the youngest of the 4 daughters, who had suffered through her childhood under the weight of these events, has since grown up and become a paranormal investigator herself, suggesting that whatever she experienced in that house, she's chosen to transform it into a kind of purpose. Jack Smurl died in 2017. By multiple accounts, the experience had changed him profoundly. Janet and her adult daughters continue to live in the West Pittston area and have reported no paranormal activity since that final exorcism. The house on Chase Street remains standing, and as far as anyone can verify, it has been quiet ever since. So what really happened in the house on Chase Street? The most popular answer, the one that made it into books and television, is that a family was genuinely tormented by a demonic entity along with 3 spirits over the course of more than a decade. That answer is what the Warrens believed. It's what the family came to believe. And for a lot of people who've heard the case, it's the most compelling answer. But there are other possibilities, each with their own internal logic and their own evidence pointing toward them. Each of them would explain at least some of what the family reported, and none of them can be entirely ruled out. What we can say with certainty is this: something happened in that house. Something frightening enough to keep a family in a state of terror for 13 years. Something real enough that it affected every member of the family, spread to their workplace, followed them even when they left town, and eventually forced them to become public figures in order to escape it. Whether that something was supernatural or psychological, ancient or modern, a demon or a disease, a haunting or a tragedy, the Smurl family experienced it as real, and it changed them forever. Today, more than 35 years after it all began, the case remains one of the most controversial and most debated hauntings in American history. And maybe that's appropriate, because maybe the real answer, the true answer about what happened on Chase Street, is something that each of us has to decide for ourselves, based on what we choose to believe is possible. All we know for certain is this: the house is still standing. The family has moved on. And whatever was there, if anything was there at all, seems to have finally let them go. Thank you for staying with me through this story. The Smurl case is one that deserves careful attention, not because we can prove what happened, but because it raises the most difficult questions about the line between what's real and what we believe is real. If you found this deep dive into the Smurl case compelling, I'd genuinely love to hear what you think actually happened in that house. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and your perspective matters. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the forgotten cases that shaped paranormal history, please hit that like button and subscribe for more long-form investigations into the strangest events ever recorded. Until next time, stay curious.